Hi, people. So there's a lot going on in the news at the moment. Any one of these issues are probably noteworthy. There's the Japanese state visit to the UK. There's devastating heat wave at the Hajj in Saudi Arabia. There's always incidents at the Hajj, but this year it's particularly intense heat wave. Um, Over 1,300 people have died. Um, and in Kenya, there's been violence has broken out. So there's a lot of things going on in the news at the moment. I just mentioned the Kenyan thing very vaguely because I don't know the details of it. Um, and one of those stories that's sort of been dragging on for a long time is the war in Gaza. But I think it's important to talk about this stuff. There was also a massacre in Russia this week in Dagestan, which predictably Putin blamed on Ukraine and NATO. Pathetic. Um, So yeah, there was footage emerged from the West Bank, actually not Gaza, but the West Bank. I'm just going to read out the report from the Eye. The report's by Emma Reynolds, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the implications of this. I see it. Footage of an injured Palestinian man strapped to a military vehicle by Israeli soldiers during a raid in the occupied West Bank has drawn international condemnation. Mujahid Azmi from the city of Jenin was seen tied to the bonnet of the vehicle that passed two ambulances on Saturday in video verified by Reuters. Francesca Albanese, the United Nations Special Rapporteur to the occupied Palestinian territory, called the incident human shielding. Israel's army said its troops were fired at and responded in kind with the suspect wounded and arrested. It said soldiers had violated military protocol. The suspect was taken by the forces while tied on top of a vehicle, the Israeli Defense Forces said. But that is them verifying it themselves. The military said the conduct of the forces in the video of the incident does not conform to the values of the IDF and that the incident would be investigated. The man was transferred to medics for treatment. And there's also this report in the Daily Mail by Andy Gering and Charles Falconer. I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but just a little bit of extra information. Mr. Abadi's father, Raid, 50, insisted his son was innocent. He told the Mail he was visiting his uncle and the army surrounded the house and shot him twice, once in the leg and once in the shoulder. They put Mujahid on top of the jeep and the heat of the metal burnt his skin. It's easy to imagine that if he was topless and his back was on the bonnet of the vehicle. Um, Speaking from his hospital bed, Mr. Abadi said he tried to crawl away after being shot. It stumped on my head and hit my face, my injured leg and hand. They were laughing and playing while they hit me. IDF forces spokesman said the conduct of the force in the video does not conform to the values of the IDF. The incident will be investigated and dealt with accordingly. In other words, they're dismissing it. Basically, they've been caught out and they're dismissing it. Here's a picture. Hope the quality is not too. I know the video is quite light, but I hope that's quite clear. So here we have the injured man and the footage of him on the bonnet. Now that's disgusting. That's not professional conduct whatsoever. Here's the problem with this sort of thing. Firstly, it's not isolated, and secondly, throughout this war, there has been a tendency for Israel supporters to sort of get into this knee-jerk thing about what about Hamas? Well, you don't need to sell to me how brutal Hamas is. Hamas still has hostages. Hamas is a brutal terrorist group. I don't need to be sold on that. But this isn't an isolated incident. Throughout this war, there have been numerous examples of the IDF degrading people, and I don't see any legitimate self defense going on here. This is just trying to degrade someone. Um, it's inhumane, it's disgusting, and soldiers responsible should be punished. And I don't really, it's not good enough to say, oh, but Hamas does this, Hamas does that. I mean, you're comparing a professional army or supposedly professional army to a terrorist group. So anyone who wanted to get into sort of whataboutery, it's things like this that has made me. I was going to say lose support for Israel. I still fundamentally think that what happened on October the 7th, the context of that is very important. The biggest terrorist attack Israel ever experienced. But What's going on in this war is unconscionable. I mean, tens of thousands of civilians killed and wounded, thousands of them children, entire families wiped out. It's becoming very difficult to forcefully defend Israel at this point, and I have no intention of doing so. Um, I don't go as far as saying it's genocide because genocide is a specific act of trying to wipe out an entire population. Um, I think what Israel's doing is going too far. Um, and within Israel itself, there's deep contentions about the situation of the hostages. I think Israel's lost a lot of international support in this war. You know, there was a lot of goodwill initially from Western countries, but over time, it's been eroded by Israel's actions. And every single time it's the same thing. Oh, this isn't the values of the IDF. Yet it's happening. This is not an isolated incident. There's been other examples of IDF troops looting houses, degrading prisoners, having them out in the heat for hours and hours. It's not good enough to say Hamas is inhumane towards its hostages, so therefore it's okay if the IDF behave the same way. Because there's no evidence that the people that they're degrading are even Hamas fighters. Um, things like this, I would be looking if I was going to say Rishi Sunak, but Keir Starmer in a couple of weeks, saying, is it really morally sustainable that we could continue just giving Israel arms without question? Um, I would be seriously drawing a red line and saying if this continues, it has continued. Not about the military campaign in of itself, but the fact it's become so inhumane. I mean, okay, you can't have any military campaign without death, without suffering, but the extent of civilian suffering in this is just horrendous. I think where the pro-Palestinian side has went wrong is there is far too many people who turn a blind eye to what Hamas done, and they are openly sympathetic to Hamas. But I really have lost a lot of sympathy for Israel because fundamentally I don't know how anyone could look at images of wounded Palestinian children, people whose entire families are wiped out, and say, oh, it's just collateral damage. Have this desensitized, inhumane attitude to that. Um, but importantly, it's actually not very strategically smart because it's just going to create bitterness in the region. I mean, Israel's vast large support that in the Trump administration, one of the few good things he done was get diplomatic improvements between Israel and some of its neighbours. I think a lot of that's been eroded by Netanyahu's scorched earth policy. You have his far right cabinet minister actively supporting, I forget the guy's name now, but he actively supports far right settlers who are actively stopping aid getting into the Gaza Strip. That's just horrendous. So I can say I support Israel's right to defend itself, but at this point, I find it very hard to be a cheerleader for Israel's military actions in Gaza because the amount of civilian suffering, mass death that is going on there, that it's no good to say this is all the fault of Hamas. Yes, Hamas started the conflict, but I hold Israel responsible for its own actions. I mean, that just goes without saying. Just as Hamas is responsible for taking those hostages. There may be some pro-Israelis who say, well, the thing about human shield, that's exactly what Hamas does. But again, is that the bar you want to set? Do you want to, say, well, we're just going to reduce ourselves to the devils of a terrorist group? That was a little message saying I need to free up storage space, so I'll round this up. But, I mean, saying the IDF says this is not the values of the IDF and they'll be investigated and, treated accordingly. That I think that's basically them trying to dismiss it. There may be some mild reprimand for the soldiers responsible. I do think there's a contingent of the IDF that is quite sadistic and they don't behave like professional soldiers. I think they're hell bent on revenge. I think that's what this is about. It's not about, targeting Hamas directly. It's just about revenge on all Palestinians. I do believe that. I do believe there's a far right element, a neo nationalist, um, yes, ultra Zionist, aggressive approach to this, which is all Palestinians are the enemy. And moderate Israelis are being drowned out in this because I imagine they'd be deemed as traitors if they don't go along with it. Um, But yeah, I do have a big problem with some of the things Israel's doing, and it's not good enough to say, oh, it's just the one-off or something, because it clearly isn't. This is happening over and over and over again, and every time it's the same thing. Also, the world is going to look at this and say, wait a second, thousands and thousands of children are dead. Why is Israel the victim now? I don't entirely agree with that because Israel clearly was the victim on October the 7th. But I think the optics here is it's engaging in collective punishment. And this attitude of collateral damage, I think, is so inhumane. Um, I mean, it's grotesque seeing the number of civilians that have died, and some of that, frankly, will be at the hands of British weapons donated to Israel. Um, So I think Starmer's government need to look very, very carefully at this. Also, arming Saudi Arabia with what's been going on in Yemen. I'm no pacifist, but I think when the civilian suffering is so bad, then it's unconscionable to just say Israel should have a green light to do as it pleases, and it can use self-defense as an excuse, or it can use October the 7th as an excuse. After 9/11, the United States couldn't just do as it pleased. Yes, there was controversial wars, but there wasn't a notion of there's a green light to do that. Well, it should be the same principle here. And you could draw other examples, Russia and Chechnya and so on. Terrorism is a terrible thing. Terrorists should be stopped. But I do think this is amounting to collective punishment at this point, and the Palestinians are being totally dehumanized.